friends and listeners, here we are, and I'm not sure if many of you realise, but we've got a little series going on with James Wyatt. We've already had the first episode, which was based on human factors, and now we've got the second one. And just like we did at the original launch, I'm just going to pick a topic out, and James, ever present, ever confident, ever knowledgeable, we'll start talking about that particular subject matter. So if you just bear with 1 second. And here we are. And today's subject, or episode 2 subject, James, is training. Bit of an obvious one, so no real shock there for you, my friend. But just again, for those who are tuning in, didn't listen to the first episode, it's well worth it. Please do. And for those that haven't, my guest today is James Wyatt, who's the general manager of Aero Concept. Also a friend, an ex-colleague, and somebody I always love to have exchanges with. So, James, welcome on board again.
Thanks, Chris. Happy New Year. Nice to be here again and looking forward to discuss the topic of training. I'm sure it's going to be an interesting episode.
Yep. And we won't overkill it, James. And what we'll do is we'll focus on some key areas. So the fact that you said Happy New Year and Happy New Year back, sir, it normally reflects when people say, you know, what's your New Year's resolution, or what are you going to do, or what do you wish you hadn't done last year, etc. So with that sort of twist in mind, everybody's had the chance now to look back on COVID, and to be honest with you, I'm fed up with it. But when everybody looks back, there has to be learnings. So the topic I want to talk to you about today on training is basically what's the most effective way now moving forward to ensure the correct level of competency, because costs have been going down for a long time, and we all know it feeds over, floods over. And then eventually people have got less training, or the training isn't as good as it should be, or it goes online instead of face-to-face. It hasn't got the technical element. It's almost like a tick box exercise for regulatory criteria. And now we've got a loss of experience. The old grey matter's gone. You've got people being pushed into positions under a lot of pressure. You don't have enough people doing the basic jobs. So the competency side of training and the feet on ground, you know, the business sustainability side of it is so important now, James. So the question to you is, what do you think is the most effective way to approach that minimum required competency to do the job as safely and as efficiently and cost effectively as possible?
Yeah, it's a great question. How long have we got? If we cast our minds back to the first episode, we talked about human factors, and we talked about it's all about the people. And I think we spoke at length as well about the whole onboarding process for new employees within organizations. We talked about the high levels of attrition that have taken place, organizations losing people, the industry bouncing back now on the passenger side, particularly on the ground handling side, where airports, airlines and ground handlers have been struggling to attract people, and all about the retention of the people is key. And that toolkit, the foundation, is training. So the people need to be, when you say the phrase they need to be trained, well that's all well and good. And you mentioned tick box exercise, and a lot of organizations would just simply do that tick box exercise as part of their onboarding process to say, yes, we have completed the training, whether that's company training or whether that's regulatory training, whether that's security, dangerous goods, and so on, before working in, for example, an operational environment. And obviously they're all heavily regulated by the civil aviation authorities and the local authorities in the countries where they're operating when you talk about security and dangerous goods. But how to retain competence, I think for me it's the foundation of investment of time into the people to train them. Don't see training as a burden or a tick box exercise. Training is investment, and it's really about the investment in the people, ultimately leading to business sustainability, to business retention, to business continuity. And if the people are trained and they have the right competence, and we'll probably come to this a little bit later on how to assess the competence. So a training course is all well and good. We can go to the classroom for 5 days. We can learn about, let's take dangerous goods as an example. We can learn as a cargo handling agent what it means to accept a consignment of dangerous goods for carriage on an aircraft, and I have to sit in a classroom for 5 days. I have to pass a course at 80%, and therefore I receive a certificate which is valid for 24 months or 2 years, which says, yes, I am now certified to accept consignments for the carriage by air. But I then have 24 months in which I have to exercise those skills. Well, the level of competence has to be checked on a regular basis within those 24 months period. So let's take a pilot as an example, right? A pilot has to go to the simulator. I think the regulatory requirements in Europe regarding EASA is every 6 months, for example. They have to go for their so-called check, where they have a check captain or a check pilot that is then responsible to check that they are still highly skilled to be able to fly the aeroplane, and they practice various emergency procedures, whether it's an engine out on takeoff, emergency landings, ditching in water, and so on. So they're measuring their competence on a regular basis. And I think there are various courses within air cargo that are very, very much classroom based, and it's kind of, well, you've done it, you've got the certificate, off you go. And I think we need to move more and more and more into that competency-based approach from intervals of checking, because I think we're very good at just letting people run. And dangerous goods is another great example. Effective the 1st of January this year, so just 10 days ago, organizations now must assess the competence of their workforce to make sure that they are continuously competent to perform their tasks and functions, whether that's acceptance, whether that's handling general cargo, whether that's doing classical check-in, and all of that. So to answer your question shortly, I know I've gone a long way around, but for me, it's about setting the foundation, seeing training as an investment, not a burden, and assessing the competence on a regular basis for the benefit of the individual and ultimately for the benefit of the business.
Yep. No, that's sound, James. And the fact that you use the dangerous goods within the last 3 weeks, I've done a couple of desktop audits and using Teams with 2 airlines and also 2 handling agents. And not long ago, they had their IOSA audits with 0 findings. Yet, when I was going through the dangerous goods side of things, asking them about, who had Cat 6, etc., fantastic. Showed me the schedule, showed me everything. And then I asked, how often do they actually do a dangerous goods check? And we went through the roster, and we also went through the shift changes. And 3 people who obviously, they did their test, they got their mark, everything. They hadn't done a dangerous goods exercise or shift for 8 months. Each time they came up for dangerous goods, they swapped their shift with somebody else because they just didn't like doing it.
Yeah. So therefore, they're not able to practice what they've learned, and they're therefore not able to retain a level of competence that enables them to carry out those functions successfully, which ultimately leads to, in the case that they do have to do a check, is there a safety risk there? Is there a quality risk there? Well, the chances are certainly higher in that case.
Exactly. And it's a risk. And when I look back, and I know we both worked for Lufthansa, but I remember when I did my very, very first Cat 6, I think I had to do something like a week's DG where somebody who was qualified watched every single check I did. And then they passed me out, and then I was let to go loose. And then you had follow-ups on a regular basis. And you weren't allowed to swap your DG shifts unless it was for another DG shift.
Yeah, sure. No, I understand that. Just from a regulatory perspective, Chris, we're quite good in compliance. Category 6 no longer exists as of the 1st of January in accordance with Table 15A for the listeners who are very, very much involved in dangerous goods. So now it's all about focused on the tasks and the functions that the people do without limiting it to categories where training is now becoming, as well as checking the competence, within the 2 years, it's also giving the flexibility to train people within the responsibilities that they do have. For example, if I'm a freight forwarder and I'm only shipping UN 1215, just as an example, then I'm just going to be trained within that UN number and all the things that impact that UN number. I don't need to sit and be trained on radioactive material and all the other things where within the 2 years outside of the classroom, I'm not going to be practicing that because my business simply doesn't touch those areas. So it gives a lot more freedom. What it does do from an industry perspective is it now puts more pressure onto the corporate organizations that outsource training to third-party providers, because in that case, the training provider is just as it says on the tin, it's the provider. So you send your employees to me, I train them in accordance with the regulation, I give them a certificate, they're certified for 2 years, but within that 2 years, when they come back to you, you as the employer are therefore responsible, in line with the regulations, towards the Civil Aviation Authority, to demonstrate that your people are competent within that 2-year period.
Exactly.
So that fine line of how, and again, we're focusing on dangerous goods here, but the fine line of who is responsible for what has definitely been further defined, which I believe is a great thing from a safety perspective, but it's also a huge adjustment for industry for these organizations that do outsource their training.
Yeah, but I'm in agreement with you. I think it's been long overdue. It's great that it's coming in, and it will make a difference because it's practical. And the other thing, you're talking about organisations outsourcing, etc. But anybody now who's in a COO or a CEO or a position of accountability, they've got to realise what's involved. And it's at that level, James, that I really do constantly get disappointed that people cannot see the benefits of doing things correctly and being on top of whether or not the levels of competence are as they should be, and not just relying on a memory test at the end of 1 day, 2 days, 5 days, or whatever it is. It's wrong. And the shock is going to come to somebody. Everybody else will learn from that shock, like our industry always does. But that incident or whatever's going to happen, that's when people then will think, oh, my goodness me, there but for the grace of God.
Yeah, I think it works both ways, right? If you think about also complacency, right? If I'm somebody, that goes onto a training course and I leave with, let's say, 95%, then I believe that I'm competent, fully competent, within that job. So therefore, I might become a bit more complacent because I think, well, I passed the course at 95%. I'll just continue do my approach day in, day out. But that's definitely not the case. And as we know, with dangerous goods, we have to be alert every single day. So competence, the measuring of competence, and the communication of competence, and also organizations need to have the ability that when people do not demonstrate the competence, that they pull them out of that role. Yep. They don't just see it as a number in a position, that they proactively say, you're not competent currently within this role. We need to retrain you. We're going to do some more classrooms, some more on-the-job training until you reach that level of competence. Well, that does two things. It gives the employee the required skill set and the confidence to do it, but it also gives the organization the ability to plan and to trust that people are executing their roles. 2023 from an air cargo perspective is going to be hugely interesting, right? We all know the challenges which are coming. Capacity is back, volumes and rates are dropping. Now it's all about quality. It's got to be about quality. And ultimately, from my point of view, the quality comes from the employees having that foundation and having that toolkit to execute on a consistent basis. That's ultimately what leads to it. And as the employee, if I feel I have the right toolkit to do my job, I feel comfortable, I'm more likely to stay with that organization than to look for something else.
100%, James, 100%. And what you're saying there about a toolkit, it's and also what you're saying about training, it's like preventive maintenance. If you want to look after your car, you service it regularly. If you want to look after your equipment, you service it, you test it, you do everything on a regular basis. Well, people are no different. You want them to keep their knowledge. And, you know, how many people would get on a plane and say, and be happy when the pilot says, oh, by the way, I was originally trained in 1969. I haven't had a day's training since. Yeah. And the same thing with a heart consultant or something. You'd think, oh, you know, would I let him put me under the knife? And why would people think differently about any job they're doing? It's all about competency. And like you said, you know, quality, safety, business sustainability, those things are so important. And it's continuity and contingency that all senior managers should be looking at on a regular basis.
Yeah, I think we also have to look at the method in which people are trained, right? We're all, you know, we're very good at doing this traditional classroom, this traditional classroom training and everything. But as we've seen with COVID, media forms, dynamics have changed. The whole virtual world is now present, even as things are coming back or are back. We're still doing a lot of business and also training, virtually. So if I'm training somebody in a virtual classroom, if I'm doing self-study online, that provides certain benefits of flexibility for organizations, that I don't have to send my people to a training center. They can stay in the office or at home. It reduces cost and everything. But how's the actual execution and the outcome of that training, and how does that then link, to competence? And to go back to the example of dangerous goods, as a training provider and as the employer, so those two different parties, there has to be that close level of communication before the training. So the provider of the training needs to know who's coming, what their background is, what they've been trained in. If the employer wants specific things to be targeted for that employee, the training is executed. And then the same on the other way around. The training provider then needs to give back to the employer that feedback that demonstrates for the individual employee their overall result, where their strengths were, their weaknesses, what needs to be looked at then, within the 2 years before they come back to the classroom. So that for me is all about competence. It's that full continuous cycle. It's not just about sitting in a classroom or on an e-learning course or whatever. Training is a daily task. And training comes in all different forms, and competence and the assessment of competence is part of training, and that is the foundation. If organizations do that, the results will speak for themselves.
Yeah. And what I like, just to end, James, what I like to do when I'm doing training, right at the beginning, everybody likes to do an icebreaker and all that, which I find a little bit of a pain in the butt. Most people get to know everybody during the course of the training. The last thing they want to do is take turns in telling them who they are, what they've done. But what I do like to ask them is how many of them had their managers actually prep them for the training and talk to them about what to expect and tell them what they expected back from them when they came back from the training, so that there's a return on investment of the training. And I think the last 6 sessions I've done, it's either been 100% nothing and maybe 5% was just, you're going for it. And I think that's such a shame as well, because they all said that they didn't feel that their managers really cared. It was just something that everybody had to do. But if they think their managers don't care, the likelihood of them caring as well is also going to be questionable.
Yeah, I think to give you a clear example of that one, if you go back to the company that we both worked for starting off in the UK, was Lufthansa Cargo. That was always a prerequisite of going on to a course in the Lufthansa Cargo Training Center, that you had a session with your boss prior to the course, before you flew there, and then also a feedback session when you came back, and that was really, really good. So yeah.
Well, listen, mate, as always, plenty to talk to. We could go on and on and on forever, but I will see you shortly for the 3rd episode, and we'll see what that brings. Thank you again for your time, James.
Looking forward to it. See you soon, Chris. Thanks.
Cheers.